Cool. So the topic today was biblical and religious inaccuracies. So could you tell me some of the most prominent ones that you think were influential in your conversion?
Yeah, for sure. I think the thing that had me thinking differently was to really put into question the whole concept of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and cross-checking the even the quotes from the New Testament authors from the Gospels like Matthew and Luke, where they cite passages from the Old Testament like Isaiah 7:14 and with the whole virgin birth doctrine. Yeah, any passage that is quoted in the New Testament from the Old Testament, I started looking into the translation and how the Bible that I was reading was translating the Hebrew text. And because in seminary I learned how to translate Hebrew and Greek, I was able to kind of check and see it for myself. And I learned the tools of doing research and consulting lexicons and doing word searches and like read the stuff that scholars would also read in order to translate the Bible. And I began to realize that even the authors themselves were either misquoting the Old Testament text by changing the word order or changing the tense of a key verb. They would add information. If you look at the context from which they're quoting or citing from, and you give it a critical analysis and you compare what one is trying to say versus what the Old Testament is saying, and it doesn't match up. So it's like, it's not just an issue with Bible translators sort of catering a translation to accommodate this belief in this Messiah, Jesus, but also the New Testament authors themselves doing sort of like shady stuff with the Hebrew Bible in order to make that work. And that's what did it for me, is just seeing how even the gospel authors themselves were misquoting and mishandling the Hebrew Bible, and how it doesn't match up.
Do you
So
have
if
some specific
Judaism
examples?
was true, there's no way that Jesus of Nazareth could be their Messiah, because it just doesn't work.
Could you give some specific examples?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Isaiah 7:14, quoted by Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. So here you have a table comparison of different translations. The very first one on the left is one that comes off the Masoretic text, which is like the Hebrew Old Testament that most scholars use to translate the Old Testament from, along with the Septuagint and maybe even the Dead Sea Scrolls nowadays. But it's the main one. It reads, "Therefore, the Lord of his own shall give you a sign. Behold, the young woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel." And then when you see the authors, the translators for the New American Standard Bible, they put a word in there that reads virgin. Not only that, but they say that she will bear a son. And when in the original Hebrew is not it's not like there's going to be a future pregnancy, but rather the person that the prophet Isaiah is actually talking about in Isaiah 7:14 is actually his wife. And she was already pregnant at the time. So she already has a child. So she was already pregnant. But the New Testament authors make it out to be where this is a prophetic future conception when it was not. And then it says that she will call his name Emmanuel, which doesn't seem like much significance, but they are sort of changing what the Hebrew text is saying in order to make this fit into a prophecy fulfillment. When if you go back to and you read the rest of that chapter, Isaiah is referring to a child that is soon to be born. And if you read about the context of that story, nothing would make sense if in the mind of King Ahaz, who was the one receiving that sign, um, or he was the person that was supposed to be looking for this particular sign. It wouldn't have made sense if Isaiah meant that this had to be something that would take place 700 years into the future. in a completely different political context and different scenario altogether. So, and then you can see how the King James does the same thing by using a word that, and I hadn't mentioned anything about that yet, but really the Hebrews just reads young woman. Um, there is a different word that Hebrew would have used, they would have used if the purpose was to speak of the person's sexuality. That's batula is a different Hebrew word that should have been used had the author intended to say anything about her virginity. So that wasn't even the point. Something else about that passage is if you read the rest of that section in Isaiah, the sign is not this miraculous conception, which is the case that the New Testament authors are telling us, and that is that this is a virgin, no intercourse is implied, and then it's conceived by the Holy Spirit. But in the case of this original context in the Isaiah, the sign was not about the conception. The sign was, if you keep reading the text, is right around the time when the kid is old enough to have like some maturity. And it even says before, by the time the kid is able to say mom or dad. So within a few years time frame is what the king is supposed to be looking for. That by this time, those that oppose you, namely the king of Samaria and the king of Israel, and also the Assyrian Empire, that are like, there's a whole thing. They're trying to invade Judea, and the prophet is telling him to have hope that God will be on your side. And so Isaiah essentially saying, hey, by the time this kid can speak, God will intervene and Jerusalem will be saved. And that's the sign that God was on their side. The sign was not that there will be some miraculous conception. So even that aspect of that scripture, the New Testament author is just twisting to conform to what I would consider more of a Greco-Roman influence on this Messiah figure, that it's not the same thing that Isaiah is referring to.
Cool. So what do you know when or why this change was made?
So I think, so what happened right around I'd say right around the second or first century BC, the people that lived in that area of the world would have had access to a Greek Old Testament, or the LXX, where it's believed that many of the books of the Hebrew Bible were translated into a Greek text, and that Greek text circulated. And so it's very possible, and I think most Christian scholars would agree, that the authors of the New Testament, perhaps even Jesus himself, would have had access to this Greek Old Testament. So when you read the Greek Old Testament, it does use a word that in today's into today you would translate it as virgin. They use a word in Greek in place of the Hebrew word alma. They use parthenos, which it would translate to virgin, but that's a mistake they made. And perhaps there are some scholars who believe that when the LXX came to be, the word parthenos did not specifically translate to virgin, and that there's perhaps some, every word has different usages and definitions, and so perhaps that word could have still meant just young woman, because that, if that's the case, it trumps the whole Virgin Mary doctrine. And even in the Catholic Church, they have this thing called the perpetual virginity, which means that she never lost her virginity. which to me is nonsensical because, eventually she gave birth to Jesus, right? So I'd say the mold was broken. But nonetheless, they do claim that. Um, anyway, so it's perhaps it's possible that they may have chose Parthenos, and they may have thought that it had something to do with it, but they're wrong. I mean, honestly, I think Christians give the gospel authors too much credit, because they presuppose divine inspiration, so they could never be wrong. But if you read the entire context from where they're citing this passage, it's clear that it's the wrong context, and that they're applying a new meaning to it. So I think that's where this came from. They just probably looked at the Old Testament and thought, "Hey, what passages can we pull from to corroborate this thing that we're trying to, this argument that we're making in favor of this super God, this Son of God, Jesus."
For sure. We do have a super chat. Thank you, James Earl, for the super chat. Yet again, fantastic pod. Keep it up and take my money. Appreciate it. We'll always take your money. It's my favorite thing to do. We also have a question from the audience. There's another super chat. Ricky Johnson uses a emote, pair character, punch in the air. I don't know why it just translates those into text. It's very funny.
Mhm.
We have a question from Little Miss Testicles. Has he read any of Bart Ehrman's work?
Yeah, for sure. I'm familiar with Bart Ehrman. He was actually one of the authors that I had to read in seminary. I took a class by Daryl Bach, who's one of their prized scholars, and it was a course about the life of Jesus. And in it, we had to read Bart Ehrman's Introduction to the New Testament, which is a standard text for most New Testament seminary classes. And it was just interesting to see how, and that's how you began to. I became aware of issues with the historicity of Jesus because of reading Bart Ehrman. So, yeah, I am familiar, and I do recommend his works. I think he's remarkable. He's fascinating.
Gotcha. And so to go back to the quotes here, how did this quote challenge your belief in religion? Like, what is it about this quote that makes it's difficult? Because I imagine most Christians would just say, "Oh, it doesn't really matter. It's not that important." Why is this an important distinction to make?
Yeah, I think what it does for me is it provides uh, a clear and cut example of how the Bible really is just a man-made book, and in how I, as a former fundamentalist, had to put into question that this really was something that a God inspired. And so once you realize that, hey, perhaps you've been deceived a little all these years, um, then you begin to sort of be a little more open-minded to even questioning whether or not a God exists. And I think that's when I became a little more critical of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God, um, having already set aside the possibility that this God is here telling me um, that I'm being a fool for not being an atheist, for being an atheist. So it's a start. At least it was a start for me.
What other kind of examples do you have normally that moved you towards the atheist fence?
Um, so I think once you start being a little more critical of the Bible, then you start kind of reading other passages or other books that just shock the shit out of you, to be honest with you. Stuff that happens in the book of Numbers, this God being so vengeful and so finicky about everything, and evil in many times, in the sense of not having grace for people, or just killing a dude because he reached forward and tried to save the Ark of the Covenant, and he was not supposed to touch it, but he did anyway, and God struck him dead. Nadab and Abihu in the book of Numbers 2. And forgive me, I don't do well with citing chapters, but these two guys, they figure, hey, let's offer some incense, and they went inside the temple and they offered incense, and God struck them dead because they were not allowed to go in there. You read passages like the story when the people put into question, why was it that only the descendants of Aaron were allowed to become priests in the temple, and Moses comes out and he tells them to line up and bring all their families, and then God's wrath comes over, and he opens up the earth and swallows hundreds of people. And as a former believer, I'd read that and be like, well, I don't know, maybe God's trying to teach us people a lesson. Maybe it's just hyperbole, or maybe it's poetry. It's like, as a believer, you just anything you could use to justify your belief in this perfect, moral, all loving, benevolent, all knowing, all powerful God. Just about for any reason, you just justify him. Um, and I think it was because, for me at least, I had this belief in the Bible's message that we all have this corrupted mind, that unless we are believers, that we can't really understand spiritual things, that only the Holy Spirit can reveal stuff to you, that outside of God in your life, you're worthless. So these are the sort of things that, when you're like, okay, well, if that's not true because the Bible isn't true, then what else is there? And there really wasn't anything. All you have is, for the existence of God, philosophical arguments that don't amount to anything. And so I will remain kind of agnostic in the belief of a God until something shows up that can reveal him or herself in a more tangible way, in a more real way. So yeah, that's where we stand.
We have another question from the audience. It's James
Right.
Earl asks, ask him what are the most problematic debates he has had.
Yeah, I think I've had a few. And whenever it becomes a philosophical argument, that's when I don't like. We could talk about like how there's just not any evidence, for any material evidence, any empirical evidence for a God, and we're gonna wait all day long for someone to provide anything other than some sort of philosophy or some sort of perspective that, I don't know. I think that in the end, if the person still insists on believing in a God in the way they do, that, I don't know, it's kind of hard to. I try to avoid philosophical debates. I
You
don't
said
think they really go anywhere.
you and your wife are trying to get more debates for your YouTube channel. Have you done many yet?
Not in English. We just in Spanish, but not in English. So I wanted to start my own channel first, and I've done a few videos so far. So I'm now gonna start looking for opportunities. But yeah, I wanted to do that for myself first.
Cool. Have you contacted Modern Day Debate yet to try those?
Not recently. I checked with him earlier, and but no, I haven't been serious yet to go on a
Gotcha.
debate. Yeah.
I know the what's it? The UDC Oz started his debate con thing again. You can contact them. They might have some options available as well. So you said you avoid more of the philosophical debates. Why is that?
I find them difficult to address. I mean, I think, yeah, it's we can sit here and point out the logical flaws from them, but I don't know. I haven't had much good luck with them, I guess.
Gotcha.
I know you do a lot. You address that a lot. I mean, that's
Yeah, it's definitely my focus. It's more
yeah,
of
it's
those kind of
your
things.
focus, right? Yeah.
I typically avoid the biblical ones. I don't really like biblical debates because I think that they're ambiguous. Like you can interpret it any way you want and kind of make it fit, kind of a thing. Have you had any experiences with that?
Yeah, so that I do enjoy because, like, unlike most, I'm able to read from the purported original languages, and I've got lots of tools to do research on those texts, and most people don't. So
Cool. So like,
if all you know is English, then as a debater of the Bible, then all you're left with is um, an interpretation, which is what an English translation is. It's just an interpretation of something. Um, and I enjoy a bit of looking into archaeology and looking into evidence of other things. Like I've realized that Genesis was not an entirely, in my opinion, is not entirely an original inspiration. I think that it borrows from even more ancient um, scriptures, ancient literature that writes about the creation of the world, like the Enuma Elish. And so I've enjoyed learning from the other myths that talk about things like the flood as well. I think that was really impressive to see how the flood account with Noah, you have a character that is considered righteous and worthy of being saved. And God approaches him. Well, that's just like how it is in the Enuma Elish. Or there's a character named the Athrohasis, and he's also approached by a god, and he tells him to build an ark and to keep his animals in there. And then when he comes out of the ark, when the flood is over, or when it stops raining, there's, instead of a dove, it's ravens. They both offer a sacrifice to their god. They both get drunk. I mean, it's like they just took an older myth that people maybe found impressive, or it was effective for them to scare, put the fear of God on people, because that's what it's doing. It's, hey, if you don't obey, God will kill us all at an instant. And they just changed the names and and put their stamp on it. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. If there was a God inspiring, or a Holy Spirit that's inspiring Genesis, um, why would he? Why would he copy something that he should have known that was already in circulation? It was an old story, just rebranded. And Jesus is very much the same. He's a rebranding of a bunch of Greco-Roman gods, and to give it authenticity or to make it reputable, the people that started that whole movement took the Hebrew Bible and called it the Old Testament. Um, in a way, no different than, say, the Book of Mormon pulls from the Bible and has this new thing.
So we got another chat question from Elliot. He asked, when you left religion, how did that impact things on like your sense of morality, and what did you realize was real even without the Bible's teachings?
That's a great question. Um, in terms of morality, I think that it improved my thinking, my philosophy on morality, because it's when you are when you're a believer, you at the end of the day, you're doing things because you're afraid that God's gonna punish you. At the end of the day, you're worried about not making it into hell. So you're either gonna follow the law so that you can earn your way to paradise, or you're gonna accept the Christian message of faith, and but which then it has to lead to works. So everything leads to having this mentality where you got to do something in order for you to be saved from or to earn something. But I realized that when you take that out of the equation, so what do you have left? You're either benefiting yourself or you're benefiting someone else. And I think that was the part that was missing from me, is that there's good in being selfless. There's good in helping other people. There's something about contributing to like this mutual benefit of just following certain rules. And I think morality is still there. It's just not this objective morality. It's not about like some God created it and there are these ancient precepts. No, but rather there are things that we as people have become to all agree on. So think of it as a social contract, or I kind of see it that way. In that if I care about others' well-being, that's gonna that's gonna carry on to me. I can benefit from other people benefit, and so ultimately, well-being ought to be the sort of like the end, right? The goal is to have all of us share a well-being that doesn't necessarily have to come from following a set of rules that some God gave us, but rather things that we have all sort of come to agree, and with the mentality that perhaps, we're not there yet, that there's more room to improve. So yeah, I think that's where we are.
Gotcha. So there was a super chat from Don. Appreciate the super chat. Are the Gospels based on eyewitness accounts?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Well, for one reason is understand that the Gospels were originally, um, they were, anonymous. Like there were not even names attached to those writings at first. And it's not until several centuries later when the church realizes, hey, we need to put a name. This must have come from someone. It can't just be anonymous, and so the names get added later. So how can and not only that, but the earliest gospel that comes out, which I believe that would have been Mark, is not coming out until like AD 60. So, or 30 to 40 years after the events took place. And so think about that. You've got a 30 to 40-year gap before anything is put into circulation. And not only that, but that which comes out first is anonymous. So there's no author behind it. And then you see Luke and Matthew come into the picture, and then you read those accounts. And if you compare the stories and you read them side by side, you'll see how Luke adds more stuff than Mark initially writes, but they're all using Mark as a template and just adding more information to it. And then you read Matthew, which oftentimes tries to either correct Mark or Luke, or tries to explain whatever the heck Luke is saying. And so at the end of the day, you have like 4 different gospels that are saying 4 different things. Yeah, they all coincide in some major stuff, but they're contradicting each other. And they're all giving you a different perspective, not because they're like 4 witnesses, and how apologists try to paint that scenario as like, well, it makes sense that they would disagree on some things, because if you take 4 people's testimonials, they're gonna, unless they conspired. But no, this isn't about conspiring. This isn't about a court case. You have these documents that are trying to tell you a story of some claiming that something happened a certain way. And we, as believers, we all agree that these things are all inspired by the same Holy Spirit. So if they're inspired by the same Holy Spirit, there should not be room for, contradictions or, okay, an example of that's like, wow, shocking. So did you know that according to, and it's been a little while, I could have these things flipped, but Matthew, according to Matthew, Mary and Joseph were already living in Bethlehem. Like that's where they lived. And so therefore, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And then they escape because other things happen, which we won't get into. But the point is that they're in Bethlehem. If you read Luke, Luke doesn't have them starting in Bethlehem. In Luke, they're in Galilee, which is another nation. Israel is not Judea, and they were not united in the first century. So they're living in another country. They just happen to come to Bethlehem because of this dubious census, which, by the way, there's no evidence, there's no historical record that can corroborate that type of census that would require people to travel to their hometown. But it wasn't like, okay, go back to where your parents came from. No, this is like if you check the calendar, Joseph, the time gap between Joseph and King David is 1,000 years or so. So Joseph is being asked to travel to the hometown where his ancestors lived 1,000 years. I mean, who knows? Do you know where your ancestors 300 years ago lived? I mean,
Nope.
how do you? So why is that happening? Well, it's because they're trying to fit this prophecy that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. And it's just a clear manipulation. They're trying to make this thing work. But at church, you never read it that way. You just you get sort of like a summary of the whole birth story, and that's the Christmas message. But when you compare what the Gospels are saying about this birth of Jesus and where it takes place, where they go, right? Who's visiting them? They're all different stories. So which one should you trust? I don't know which one to trust.
For sure. Terrar asked about free will. Free will, but if you use it, you will be punished. What is your position on free will and how it's addressed in the Bible?
Addressed in the Bible? I don't think it's addressed in the Bible. I think a conversation of free will, is a much more modern conversation than the Bible. Although I think Christianity in Christian doctrine will tell you that there is that somehow Adam and Eve story corroborates a free will, and that people are responsible, and it is because you have free will that you got to answer for your actions. But I don't think free will is actually something. I think considering an understanding of the human brain and how we as people perceive reality, I think that the brain is giving us a backdrop, if you will, of information, much of it which does not necessarily come from us. I think there's a lot of info that our brain just retains and does other things with it that we have no control of. So when when we are interpreting our reality, we're interpreting our reality not in a pure sense, but in a corrupted sense, in a way that our brains are giving us information that we are interpreting alongside with what's coming in through our senses. And so there is some sort of, I allow for some determinism that that's there, that we can't control, because we can't tell our brains what to do. Our brains tell us what to do, but we can't really tell our brain how to work. So
Hassan Praise asks, have you considered Islam? Also, have you studied Islam? Have you studied the Quran? Can you read Arabic? Because I know that.
no, I cannot read Arabic. So I have read the Quran in English, and have only read it once. And first impression, to me, the Quran, it sort of, it reminds me of, it's very much like Judaism. I think that Judaism and Islam share a lot. Um, and have I considered being a Muslim? Not really, to be honest with you. My brother is a Muslim, and him and I sort of have a little bit of history. While I was in seminary, he was like being converted Muslim, and he's come a long way, but he started out very fundamentalist, and him and I would argue about things. And so back in the day, I would say that I was pretty convinced that Islam is just another way for Judaism to express itself in the Arabic world, but never really considered or tried being a Muslim. I grew up Catholic, and I felt like perhaps we had a lot in common already. I've already tried doing this religion thing, but yeah, not sure convinced that their arguments are any better than ours.
Gotcha. Pineapple Jesus asks, what do you think of my TJump's objective model of objective morality?
What's your model? Can you summarize your model of objective morality?
Sure. So I think that there is an objective morality that's true, independent of opinion society. It's not subjective, not evolution. I think it's more like there is probably some moral facts out there, kind of like math or logic, that it's something true about the universe. And that if we looked across the universe, all life forms would try to aggregate towards one particular model of morality. And I think that would be something like any involuntary imposition of will is immoral, or to put it simply, it's more like it would be immoral to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. And as we gain in technology and intellectual capacity and resources, we will move towards making the world more like that as much as possible. And so will all forms of life, as far as I can tell.
I have no quarrels with it. I think it could be a hybrid type. Who knows? It could be a hybrid of objective morality, and then you have some things that perhaps are not all that objective. But yeah, sure.
All right. Antangelo has a question for you. Do you know Antangelo?
We've debated before.
Why don't monkeys evolve? What are they evolving to? Atheists have more faith in fairy tales.
I don't know what you mean by monkeys. What's a monkey? You got to talk about species. If you're going to address evolution, you need to address a species. So
I would say monkeys do evolve. What are you evolving to? I think we're going to evolve to the little green men, most likely. That's probably what we're going to evolve into. I actually think humans have stopped evolving for the most part, because we have corrective measures to prevent people who are of less evolutionary advantage from dying off. And so we don't evolve much anymore, but we'll probably just create technological things to boost our survivability. And so humans aren't evolving anymore. Monkeys are evolving. They do evolve. That would be my answer.
yeah. I would simply add that there's no such thing as intermediary species, that we're all in a state of
everything is one. Everything is an intermediary species.
Yeah. So I mean, everything is still in the process of evolution.
Uh,
So
it is the
in a
way.
sense,
It is the way asks. You have a really interesting accent. Where are you from? If you don't mind sharing, you can always say
yeah.
no. That's fine.
So I'm originally from Colombia, South America. However, I lived in New York City as a kid, and I'd say that I grew up in Miami. So I sort of been all over the place.
Gotcha. Winston's mom asks, um, Doctor Doctor Peralta. So apparently you now have a PhD. Do you have a PhD?
No, I stopped short of a PhD. I graduated with a master's of theology from Dallas Seminary.
Nice.
So
Given the lack of trees, I have read that if there was a Jesus, then he likely would have been a stone mason. Is that a true in your opinion?
I'm not so sure. I have heard um, scholars comment about the whole technon. I think it's the word in the New Testament that's used of what sounds like the the job that that Joseph had, and that would have made him a carpenter. But it could. I've heard also people say that that just meant skilled laborer. That you can't really put your finger on anything specifically, but it wouldn't surprise me that he did something that was manual labor, like most people at the time were. I don't know about a stonemason. I don't.
I think the question is because there were very few trees in Judea or Israel at that time. It seems like a more likely occupation to have would be a stonemason because there weren't enough trees to actually be a carpenter reliably, something along those lines.
Yeah, it's possible.
Dr. Palermo Not, who are your favorite scholars beyond Ehrman, Carrier Price, and other celebrity academics?
Yeah. So lately, I've enjoyed reading Dennis MacDonald, who is sort of leading the way with a newer scholarship on the New Testament, where he draws parallels to classical literature, works like the Iliad, um, that that seem to have been an influence in on the New Testament authors, and he shows you how, and that's fascinating. I've also enjoyed reading Francesca Stravacapoulou. I read through the Anatomy of God, where she shows you from Scripture how the God of the Old Testament was believed to have had a body and not like this immaterial, omnipresent God, but rather just a deity that's up there and that can be seen. And so she shows you where that comes from. Who else? Robert Price, he's in the list there. Um, M. David Litwa, I would add him to that list. Yeah, I think between those, you've got a lot to catch up on if that's something that interests you.
Atheist Junior asks, I think this one's for me. What's the worst debate I ever did? Probably the Jay Dyer one. Any ones that you can't actually express your opinion are probably the worst ones. Like as long as I get a chance to talk, it's not as bad. Um, Question from Brian Stevenson's: How can Untangelo debate evolution for years and not understand that we don't think humans evolved from monkeys? This is the most basic thing to know. Um,
And that's the thing. Like he's been told before. That's been explained to him an awful lot. And so, Otangelo, what is it, man? Part of me like feels like he knows he is just like a bot. He's just gonna refuse to accept it, and he'll continue arguing with you until his apocalypse comes true. Or part of me is like, I don't know, like, are you really that veiled in your understanding that you just refuse to? Because it seems very basic, but I don't know.
I think it's meant as a caricature. I technically don't think it's necessarily wrong, because like if you think from like an evolutionary perspective, there's two different clades of monkeys and apes, and those are separate things. But from the perspective of like Ontangelo and creationists, monkeys and apes are of the same kind, and so it wouldn't technically be inaccurate from that perspective to say that we came from monkeys. And so I think that it's one of those things, like Professor Dave does this all the time, where he criticizes when James Tour or the creationists say that we came from a pool of goo that got shot by a lightning bolt or whatever, but that is actually accurate. That is an accurate portrayal of abiogenesis. We do think that inanimate material went through some chemical process like a lightning bolt, and that chemical process led to self-reproducing molecules that then led to a lizard walking on land. And so I don't think it's wrong to say that we came from a primordial pool of sludge or whatever. And so I don't think it's right for us atheists to be that pedantic on the usage of language, when we can probably grasp what the intention behind it is.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That to me, there many of them are using the term as a pejorative, not as just convenient for convenience sake, because they know
Sure.
that if they say that, then it sounds absurd. It's absurd to consider that we came from a monkey because they're so stupid. You know.
Yeah, I think that that's the thing. Atheists do that too all the time, to characterize the opposing position with a relatively accurate framework that makes it seem more ridiculous because of the way it's framed, like a cosmic zombie Jew that sacrificed himself to himself for himself because he forgot to put a fence around a magical tree and a rib woman ate from it or something along those lines. So I think it's understandable why people do that. It's entertaining as well, and so I don't really have a problem for that one as much. um, Atheist Junior asks, related question: do we come from rocks? Yes, we do come from rocks. The minerals that are make up the inorganic material that produces life is in fact from rocks. So we do come from rocks, and I think that's perfectly fine to admit. Um, Tim asks, what happened to God's past bodies?
So I think, in my opinion, there's you could appreciate a bit of evolution when it comes to people's understanding of God, and I think that long time ago humans would consider things like thunder, rain, snow, volcanic eruptions, and not really knowing or understanding why these things were happening. They would attribute those phenomena to some god like spirits or something of the sort. And, before you know it, you've got a whole pantheon of gods or deities that are understood to be responsible for certain things that occur, certain phenomena that happens in nature and also in other areas of human life. So you've got a big story. But as we gradually becoming more knowledgeable of why things happen, like how does rain occur? What's really up in the sky? What's beyond the atmosphere? Then as that's happening, as we are realizing that, hey, maybe the earth is not the center of the universe, then you begin to sort of change or accommodate the theology. And so God, as the deeper that and the farther that we're able to look or search for God in the universe and not find them, the farther out that theology describes him to be. So at some point, people stopped talking about, oh yeah, I saw Yahweh up in mountain and he came down and whatever, because people know that God's not really able to, there's no God that's walking around. And so now we start changing the message, and so our religion has changed their perspective of what God is and how he is. And I think that there's enough evidence, as has been shown by scholars like Francesca Stravakopoulou, that the Bible itself taught that he had feet, that he had testicles, that he walked around, that he was seen by Moses on top of a mountain, that he resided up on as sort of a layer of rock in above in the sky, and that's how the world works. Just not anymore. Now we've gone out to space. Now we know that there's nothing up there. We know the Earth isn't round, flat anymore. The Earth is, a sphere. So now we have to change our theology, and that's what we've done with it.
Gotcha. Super chat from Dalai Lama. Do you now intentionally conduct your inquiry as a God doesn't exist, or do you still find yourself often or occasionally in the mindset you were raised and educated in? I'm 100% atheist, so I never am under the belief God exists. Not a feeling I occasionally believe. What about you?
Conduct your I mean, I don't presuppose that he does not exist. I think that my mindset now is more like I'm not gonna live my life as if he did exist until proven otherwise. So I remain open minded to being shown wrong. I can't guarantee that if I am proven wrong that there is a God that I would eventually worship this God, but I don't know for sure, if I'm gonna be honest.
Gotcha. Got another super chat from Atheist Junior. Thanks for asking my question. Appreciated the super chat. Logan Fisher asks, can you ask if he went to seminary as a Christian, and if not, what was he ever of faith? You did answer that at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes. If you want, you can answer again if you like, though.
I can add more. So I grew up Catholic, so I was baptized. I did my first communion at age 9 or 10. I did not get confirmed because by the time I was a teenager, I sort of stopped going to church, and then when I worked my way back to church, I ended up in an evangelical church. So I became Protestant evangelical, and I was that for maybe 15 years. So, yeah.
All right. Next question is K Yim Inc. What is the best seed of doubt you can plant into the atheist mind? I guess you can answer it from the theist side. What would it be? What's the best seed of doubt you can plant into the theist mind?
I mean, it would depend on what their tradition was to me. Like if they were a Christian, I would show how like Jesus is not or can't be the Messiah. I think that could wake someone up. But if there were something else, I'm not so sure. I think what's important here is having correct thinking when it comes to what should constitute as evidence. I think that's more important than anything else. Because I think many of us that were or are in the faith give a lot of credit to experiences and testimonial or anecdotal evidence, and that could be problematic because anecdotal evidence doesn't is not always the best evidence, especially for claims like God exists. So if someone can be shown how to think correctly, how to reason correctly, then renouncing to any faith should be should take place at some point.
Next question is from Hassan Praise. How does he account for the Quran saying the universe is expanding in 51:47?
I'm not so sure. I think I've read that before. And what I know about that surah is
Whoops.
that is saying a similar thing that like the Old Testament. I think there's a passage in one of the Psalms that talks about how God stretched out the heavens. And what I do remember from that passage in the Hebrew Bible is that it is referring to the sky, and the analogy is as if God, when God created the sky, or the night sky, it's as if he rolled over not a carpet, but like he rolled over a tent. He made a tent, or pitched a tent over the earth. And that's the language. The language is of stretching out a tent, as if the sky was all like equidistant, because their belief system was that the earth was flat and that the sky was a dome that's equidistant from the ground, and that everything is there, like all the stars are the same distance from us, and everything is sort of embedded into this dome cap. And so you've got to understand that the Bible is wrong, and as poetic as that might sound, you just can't excuse it. If a God really inspired this, he would have considered before saying something like that, because he would have known, right? You figure he'd know that stars are all at different distances, and to put it that way, it's not really telling you the truth. And I think that surah is borrowing a little bit from that language, if not mistaken. But I would seriously put into question the interpretation that some Islamist defenders would say, because usually while you're here from debates is that, oh, here's evidence, this is scientific evidence that the Quran is inspired, because how else would the Quran know that the universe is expanding the way that we would understand that to be in astronomy today? But I don't think that's what the Quran is saying. That would have made no absolute sense or meaning to a Muslim, when the Quran was inspired. So I think it's anachronistic to use that surah as evidence of any scientific evidence that would support the Quran.
Yeah, for sure. I think it just says that he stretches out the heavens, which doesn't actually mean the universe is expanding. It's too ambiguous to mean that. So the fact that you can make it mean that isn't actually evidence.
And it's a stretching out of the analogy of the curtain or the tent, not in the stretching out like the universe is expanding to infinity. Like,
We got a super chat from Good Question. He asks, is there something wrong with this answer? After I die and in hell, I'll stop being an atheist and I will ask the loving Jesus to forgive me and zoom me to heaven.
what?
I think it's like, is it in Christian theology? Why can't you, when you die, convert to Christianity and get into heaven?
That's in a way very astute, because I don't think that there's a verse that says specifically that you have to confess faith in Jesus before you die. I think that might be just something that it's implied. But I think, yeah, I mean, if you ask a pastor, he'll say, no, son, you have to believe now. And if you die, it's too late. So,
like, if you were going to ask a pastor which passages they would quote to try to prove that, what do you think they would say?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it.
All right. Question from Atheist Junior. What video games do you like, and have you ever played Factorio?
Never played Factorio. and I'm old school, and so I like Super Mario. um, Lately, my wife and I have been playing Super Mario 3. We got our one of our kids. We got her a Nintendo Switch, and so we stole it from her. Now we've been using it, so that's been fun.
Yeah, I do mostly AAA titles. So I'm going to get the new Harry Potter that comes out in like a week. That game looks amazing, and I have the new Dead Space, which is a remake of the old Dead Space. That one's amazing. So and I subscribe to GameFly, so they just send you for like $20 a month. They send you 2 games, and you can send them back whenever you want. That's what I do.
Oh wow.
Hassan Praise asks, how can God not be real when infinite regress is impossible?
I don't correlate those two things. Is that
So I
you
think
think the infinite regression is that? Was that talking
it's the
about the Big
Kalam
Bang?
cosmological argument. So yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument implies that there cannot be an infinite past regression of natural states or something. So if there can't be an infinite past regression, there must have been a beginning, and that beginning must be a god.
Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not convinced of what the Kalam is trying to do.
Yeah, I would say that infinite regress is not impossible. There is no logical contradiction. Even the apologists like William Lane Craig admit there is no logical contradiction. It just has some intuitive problems, which are not real problems. Intuitive contradictions are not actual contradictions, and there is no evidence that there was a beginning of all natural things. Only the beginning of our current space-time, and so there's no reason to think there is an absolute beginning. And even if there was, that beginning could have been made by like a quantum field, and there's no reason to think it was made by God. So if there is a necessary being, it could just be a natural entity like a quantum field, and not a God, and that would solve it too. So consider it not evidence. All right. I think that is it for the questions. We've been going for about an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Absolutely. Please visit me on YouTube, Apostate of Mind, just like my name title here. And if you're interested in critical analysis of the Bible and the Christian religion, commentary on apologists and missionaries that are out there trying to sell you the Jesus gospel, and you wish to learn more of a liberal side of things, if you're interested in the academic um, comment of what they're trying to sell you, that's where you're invited to come and join us and be a part of what we're trying to do with Apostate of Mind.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Oh, hopefully I'll see you at the next debate con. If James invites me, yell at him. If he doesn't, make James invite me.
Yeah,
That's
he
the
definitely
goal.
needs to. I looked for you last time and I was surprised that I didn't see you.
Yep, that's James's fault. Blame James. Yell at James. Send him
James.
angry emails.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the questions.
Absolutely. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you later.
Take care.